Boldwood presents From Provence with Love, written by Alison Roberts and read by Emma Powell. Prologue. 5 minutes. Wasn't a very long time at all. But when the rest of your life could depend on what happened at the end of that 5 minutes, it felt like a very long time indeed. Laura Gilchrist put the cap back on the plastic stick and put it on the cold porcelain edge of the bathroom basin. She set the timer on her phone to 3 minutes. Then she glanced in the mirror over the basin. It was automatic to smooth a single stray hair back into place so that her sleek red-gold shoulder-length bob was as perfect as it usually was. How good would it be to be able to smooth away the visible fear she could see in her eyes? Laura hadn't seen herself look like this since she learned how to hide fear when she was no more than about 9 or 10 years old. When she'd learned how to control her own emotions so that she could protect the people who were the most important in her life. Her family, her mother, her younger sisters. She turned her back to the mirror. It was too disconcerting to see that everything she had worked so hard for in her life, her control, success, independence, could be slipping away from her. She stood very still and waited. She jumped at the sound of the timer and turned it off instantly. As she reached to pick up the stick, she realized she had known all along what she was going to see in the tiny plastic window. 2 lines. She was pregnant. How in God's name had this happened? A sound that was probably closer to a sob than the intended huff of laughter escaped Laura's suddenly dry lips. She knew exactly how this had happened. She also knew that this was entirely her own fault. Had she, on some deeply hidden level, wanted this to happen? Part 1. Chapter 1. Look out! The urgency in her sister's voice was enough to make Laura freeze in the heartbeat before she pushed open the driver's door of the car. A millisecond later, a huge black motorbike roared past within what seemed like only an inch or two of her fingers, still curved around the latch. Both women stared as the engine noise changed to a protest of gears being rapidly downshifted. The back wheel locked enough to provide a subtle but still dramatic skid as the rider came to a halt just ahead of them, one booted foot coming down at the last moment to stop the huge bike from tipping too far. He'd stopped right in front of the destination Laura had programmed into the GPS of the rental car. The highly recommended Provençal estate agency, Dufour Immobilier. At least the distraction provided a means to wind down a rather intense conversation Laura had been having with her sister about the direction her life was going, or not going, in. Changing the subject might even be enough to stop Ellie getting out of the car while they were still at odds with each other. Has to be a courier, she said, as if the identity of the bike rider was what they'd been discussing. Nobody else would drive that badly on a bike at home. He's got a satchel over his shoulder, so he's probably delivering a sales and purchase agreement that the agent's holding his breath for. Doesn't look very professional, Ellie said. There's no signage on the bike. What is it, a Harley Davidson? It's kind of cool. Maybe he's a client. I'd be double-checking his references if he wanted to rent something from our agency. You wouldn't want to find a commercial weed-growing operation under lights in the garage. Ellie snorted. You're so judgy, Laura. Laura was silent. Perhaps she was, but, to be fair, she was harder on herself than on anyone else. She'd probably said too much already, but Ellie could do with taking a leaf out of her book and acknowledging what she needed to change in her life. How else were things going to get better? Life wasn't easy or fair. Sometimes you had to work very, very hard to get where you wanted to be, like she had. They could only see the back of the man as he pulled his helmet off and carelessly slung the strap over the handlebars of the powerful bike before walking into the agency's office building. His shaggy, dark hair was long enough to be brushing the collar of the leather jacket he was wearing, and there was a smear of dirt on the faded blue denim of his jeans. Laura couldn't see the top of the boots he was wearing, but she was deeply suspicious that they might have those curved tops and embroidered stitching popular with cowboys. On second thoughts, Laura said, my guess is that he's a handyman or a gardener. Probably gets employed to do maintenance or repairs on rental properties. Maybe he'll be the person who does the work on our house. Let's hope he's better at his job than he is at riding motorbikes then. He shouldn't have been anywhere near that close to a parked car. Laura turned her head to check the road behind before finally opening her door. It's 2:00. Time to do what we came here for. To finish what they'd come to the south of France for. They'd gone straight from the airport in Nice to the house in Tourette-sur-Loup that morning. Laura had never driven on the right-hand side of a road before, but it was exactly the kind of challenge she thrived on, having discovered long ago that a mix of focus, control and confidence could get you through most of the stickiest situations life could throw at you. You just had to be able to rise above the emotional reactions that could undermine what you were trying to achieve. It was Laura's independence and ability to problem solve that provided the building blocks of her continuing career success, working as an estate agent. Adding an international property offering to her portfolio might be a new direction, but it was one she was more than willing to embrace. Especially for a stone-built, quintessentially French cottage that was so picturesque it was more than Instagram-worthy. A terrace with a view to the rocky foothills of the Alps that looked like mountains in their own right, forests and a tantalizing glimpse of the Mediterranean Sea in the distance, even a lemon orchard. It would be far more desirable, mind you, when the damage and dust that had accumulated over too many years of neglect was sorted. There were bats residing in one of the bedrooms, electrical issues and broken shutters, a garden that was a complete wilderness. Which was why the partnership she intended to cement with this local agency was the missing piece of the puzzle. They would be able to access tradesmen without being ripped off. They would also be in a position to connect with people who wouldn't necessarily consider buying a holiday home in the south of France, but were here on holiday and found themselves falling in love with the region. The Gilchrist sisters had an appointment scheduled with the managing director of this company, Monsieur Dufour himself. They went inside. From behind the reception desk, an elegant woman in a plain black dress with a white collar gave an approving twitch of an eyebrow at the pale olive-green linen dress that Laura was wearing. But her nostrils flared ever so slightly as she noted Ellie's jeans and t-shirt. Bienvenue, she said directly to Laura. Vous devez être Mademoiselle Gilchrist. She switched to perfect English. Welcome. My name is Blondine. Monsieur Dufour is expecting you both. Come this way, please. Both the younger women came to a halt the moment they were ushered into a large office. They exchanged a glance with each other. Ellie looked as if she was trying not to smile. The man standing behind the antique desk was definitely smiling. Laura had never felt less like smiling, because she was staring at the cowboy. How on earth could someone who looked so disreputable be the managing director of an estate agency whose outstanding reputation had reached well beyond the borders of his own country? He had hazel eyes, she noticed in the briefest moment of eye contact that could be considered polite as she grappled with having to try and readjust her judgment of this man. A dark hazel that was a golden-tinged shade of a brown that reminded her of, milk chocolate? Not quite as dark as his hair, or that designer stubble for that matter, but it added up to a dark impression. Sinfully dark. And he was looking at her with such a blatantly admiring gaze, as if she was the most beautiful creature he'd ever seen in his life. With a crinkle at the corners of his eyes, as if he knew perfectly well that the admiration was not being reciprocated, but he was amused rather than offended. Good grief. The confidence of that look was as disturbing as finding she needed to interact with someone so inappropriately dressed or groomed, but quite inexplicably, Laura had to dismiss an urge to touch her hair, like a teenager trying to get the hang of flirting. How ridiculous. Laura had never flirted deliberately in her life. She was far more comfortable taking the hand that was being extended towards her in the wake of Noah Dufour's introduction, for a brief but firm handshake and another graze of eye contact that was short but to the point. This meeting was purely for business purposes. Somehow, Noah Dufour managed to hold that moment of eye contact, however, and this time Laura had to stop herself snatching her hand rather than her gaze away from his, because it felt as though his touch was burning her skin. Not that he gave any sign of having felt that heat himself. "Enchanté," he said, still wearing that undeniably charming smile. "I am delighted to meet you both. Please, sit down. Can I get you some coffee, water, wine, perhaps?" "No, thank you." Laura shook her head as she sat down, smoothing her dress over her knees. She wouldn't have been at all surprised if one of the cupboards in this office was stocked with an extensive selection of wine. With time on his hands, she could imagine this man pouring himself a glass of a fabulous red wine, putting his booted feet up on the large antique desk, leaning back in his chair and possibly striking a match to light a cigarette to add the final touch to the image of a reprobate. The man was not only charming, he was undeniably charismatic. The kind of man that Laura Gilchrist would never dream of trusting, certainly not on a personal level anyway. She knew too well that if you did, they had the power to break your entire world when they broke that trust, and your heart, like her father had, for her entire family. Charismatic, charming men were dangerous. Laura pulled in a deep, steadying breath. She wasn't in any danger right now. This was disconcerting, that was all. She'd just been reminded that somewhere, buried so deeply it shouldn't even be accessible, that pull was still there, like the poignant whiff of a scent that evoked the memory of something precious you could never have again because it had been destroyed beyond repair. She could still feel a residual warmth from that handshake, as if that match she'd imagined Monsieur Dufour using to light his cigarette was too close to the palm of her own hand. But it was nothing she couldn't handle. She could actually sense a mental door being slammed shut as she dismissed the visceral response she'd experienced that was both intrusive and unwelcome. At least this estate agent's English was as perfect as his receptionist's had been, the accent only adding more charm to the laid-back welcome they'd received. "Donc," Noah opened a file on his desk. "I understand you have both inherited a property called La Maisonnette in Tourette-sur-Loup from your uncle?" "Along with our other sister, yes," Laura confirmed. "Apparently, we're his only living relatives." "And everyone is in agreement that it is to be sold as quickly as possible?" "Yes." Laura turned her head to include Ellie in the conversation. "That's right, isn't it?" "Pretty much," Ellie agreed. She wasn't meeting Laura's gaze, however, and her voice was tight. Was it because they'd gone ahead and made the agreement in the absence of their middle sister, Fiona, who had failed to respond to the invitation to the family meeting? Or was the lukewarm response due to the fact that this inheritance had come from an uncle who had been a complete stranger? They hadn't even known he existed until the solicitor's letter had arrived. Or that they had a French heritage of their own. This uncle's French mother, their grandmother, had only moved to Scotland years after her marriage and the birth of her 2 sons. A grandmother they'd never heard of before, who'd been born and raised somewhere around this part of France. It made being here an unwelcome link to the father who had walked out of their lives probably too long ago for Ellie to have any lasting memories of him. But Laura had more than she wanted. Memories that could still surface in dreams that she had no control over. reminders of a dark side to that charisma and charm that could appear without warning and cause enough pain that the fear never quite went away. If her sisters ever had nightmares without understanding what might have sown the seeds, that subconscious awareness could well have created another layer of reasons why her younger sister didn't really want to be here. Laura wouldn't have chosen to come here with that new knowledge of their family history either, but it had been logical for the eldest Gilchrist girl to take charge. She was an estate agent herself, after all, and it was quite likely that a property in a desirable part of the south of France would be snapped up as a second home to a buyer on their side of the English Channel. It had been their mother's idea that Laura brought Ellie along on the flying visit to see the house. "Might do her a bit of good, getting away for a day or two," Jeanie Gilchrist had said. "Maybe it'll take her mind off, everything." Of course, Laura knew. They all did. But so far, taking Ellie away from their hometown of Oban, Scotland, didn't seem to be helping to distract her from what she'd had to deal with in the last few months after the loss of her baby. Her younger sister was still lost in a darkness that Laura couldn't begin to comprehend, possibly because she'd been so young when she'd learned that it wasn't going to help anyone, including yourself, to allow overwhelming emotions get the upper hand. You had to keep control, or you might drown. She couldn't blame Ellie for not paying attention to all the information Noah was imparting about how complicated it was to buy and sell property in France. But it was a little annoying when she didn't answer Laura's query. "Ellie," her tone was sharper than she'd intended it to be. "Are you even listening?" "Sorry, what?" "Noah says he's got time to look at all the things that need doing to the house tomorrow, so I'm going to give him the key. You don't want to go back there, do you?" "No." Ellie's tone was emphatic. Had she really hated La Maisonnette that much? Laura closed her eyes for a heartbeat as her breath caught in her chest. It really hadn't helped that one of the bedrooms had had a baby's cot in it. Thank goodness Noah had agreed to take care of whatever renovation and staging was needed for the presentation of this property to the market. But he was looking thoughtful as Laura handed over the huge iron key to the front door of the house. "Are you sure you don't want to clean it up yourselves? It would save you a lot of money. Many hundreds of euros, I expect. Thousands, perhaps." Noah's smile was hopeful. Maybe he wasn't keen on the effort it would take to supervise an epic cleaning and restoration job. That didn't surprise Laura any more than the idea of him having a hidden wine cabinet in his office. There was a lazy quality to his smile that suggested he didn't let hard work interfere too much with his enjoyment of life. The warmth of that smile seemed to be contagious. Laura could feel it seeping in to settle somewhere deep in her belly. Dousing it by tightening the well-toned muscles of her abdomen was an instinctive reaction. So was the firm tone of her voice. "No, I'm afraid that's not an option." The disappointment in his face was simply part and parcel of that charm, wasn't it? "Pas de problème," he said. "I will stay in touch." He picked a business card from a holder on his desk and reached to hand it to Laura. "Is the agency number. If I'm not available, then just leave a message with my assistant, Blondine." It was only polite to give him one of her own business cards in return. His fingers brushed hers as he accepted it, and Laura caught a glimmer of something very unbusinesslike in his gaze again. "My private number is also on my card," he murmured. "Please call if I can be of any assistance." This felt far too personal, almost an invitation. Laura shifted uncomfortably and broke eye contact. "When do you leave?" Noah asked. "Tomorrow. Wasn't sure how long things would take and the late flights were all full tonight." "I'm sorry I don't have the time to visit the property today, but I have another appointment." Noah's sigh was indeed regretful as he glanced at his watch. "In fact, I really need to go. I'm rather late." "No problem." That was an understatement, really. Having this man vanish could be the solution to a problem, in fact, because Laura could escape from whatever was causing this unsettling awareness of everything about Monsieur Dufour. "We're planning to have a wander around the old town here," she added, "and then we'll go and find our hotel in Vence." She would be miles away from him by then. Noah nodded as he got to his feet. He didn't seem bothered by the prospect of her disappearing from his life forever in the next minute or two. "Leave your car here, if you wish. It will be easier to walk and find a closer parking place. You got the Fondation Mag just a bit further up the road if you're fond of art. It's a very famous gallery, and the Miro Sculpture Garden is just fabulous." One eyebrow, barely visible beneath the shaggy hairstyle, quirked just a fraction, and a very different note made the tone of his voice richer, warmer. The words were almost a caress. "I would love to be showing you around there myself." Oh no, Laura didn't dare look at Ellie. Not just because she might be on the verge of giving her discomfiture away by blushing furiously. This was also awkward because Ellie had been an artist herself until the unthinkable had happened. Rubbing her nose into the fact that she'd lost more than her baby would be heartless. "Maybe not today," she said crisply, getting to her feet. She needed to escape for both their sakes now. "We're going to have a walk around the old town." There was no doubt about how magical the old walled city of Saint-Paul-de-Vence was, but Laura was still puzzled the next morning about how that brief visit to the famous tourist attraction had achieved what she'd given up hope of happening any time soon. That Ellie would find something, anything, to hold on to that might help her find her way out of that dark space she was in. Not that it mattered what had made Ellie change her mind about staying here to renovate La Maisonnette herself. This was a huge step forward, and Laura was not only applauding it, she was quite prepared to cover any associated costs herself until the property was sold. It was an investment, after all, in both the real estate market and in her sister's future. As a bonus, it was a totally new challenge for them both, and the need to make a plan and sort what was needed to begin that, all in a race against the ticking clock of Laura's flight to get back to Scotland, was energizing, exciting even. Last night had been all about making lists. Laura couldn't wait for Ellie to finish her shower this morning so they could get on with what needed to be done. Did Noah Dufour ever feel like this about his life or work? Laura doubted it. As she said to Ellie when they were walking towards the historic section of Saint-Paul-de-Vence, if that man was any more laid back, he'd be horizontal. That an image of that shaggy hair on her pillow, framing those intense hazel eyes, appeared in her head so readily was even more irritating than the fact that she was thinking about him at all. Surely she'd got that out of her system when she'd been staring at the ceiling for far too long, trying to fall asleep last night. It was too early to ring anyone else in the UK, but man was always up at the crack of dawn. The running water in the bathroom would make the conversation completely private, but Laura still stepped out onto the balcony of their hotel room. Her mother was worried about Ellie not coming back when she needed to be out of her apartment so soon. "I'll organise it," Laura promised. "I know a cleaning firm that will make it spotless as soon as we get her stuff out of there." "But what will we do with all her things?" "I don't know, ma'am. I guess we'll just store it. You'd have room for the cot in the attic, wouldn't you? We can fill it up with all the clothes and toys and such like." "Have you talked about that with Eleanor? Is this really a good idea?" "No, of course we haven't talked about it." Like everything else that could cause painful reminders, they tiptoed around the logistics of Ellie taking any first steps away from the shattered remains of her old life. Laura closed her eyes for a heartbeat. But she said she's happy for us to clear the place out, and I don't think there's any need to remind her of the details of what she's leaving behind. This is the chance for a fresh start, a completely clean slate, in fact. Couldn't be cleaner. All she's got here so far is a change of knickers and a toothbrush. How impulsive would you have to be to do anything with no more than a change of knickers and a toothbrush? Laura couldn't begin to imagine doing it herself. She had been as worried as her mother that Ellie might not have the emotional resources to put her life back together. but she didn't want her mother to undermine the courage Ellie was demonstrating in her decision to stay in France alone. And she heard her breath coming out in a heartfelt sigh. "No, I'm not sure it's the best idea, but I think she thinks it is, and that's what matters, isn't it? Look, I better go, Ma'am. Ellie will be out the shower any minute, and we've got a ton of shopping to do before I head back to the airport. I can't miss my flight. I've got that awards dinner to get to this evening, and it's the biggest night of the year in the real estate world." A text pinged into her phone as she ended the call. "Bonjour, Laura. Can I help you with anything this morning?" Laura's heart actually skipped a beat. She'd given Noah a card that had her personal cell phone number on it, but she hadn't expected him to use it. No, that wasn't true. She just hadn't been prepared for the tiny thrill it gave her that he had, even though his message couldn't have been any more professional, could it? "Tout est bien. Mais, merci beaucoup. No." Laura had learned French at school. It had been one of her favourite subjects. She'd even spent a gap year in France. Not that she'd had any idea there was genuine French blood in the family back then, but it had been surprisingly pleasant to be able to brush some of the rust off her language skills at the airport and restaurants yesterday. It didn't excuse her imagining that she could hear an echo of Noah's voice as she'd read that message from him, however. To be reading the words in her head with a French accent and hearing her name spoken with an inflection, the guttural growl on the letter R that made it sound so, good grief, sexy. The sooner she left this sultry part of France behind, the better, Laura decided. It was doing her head in. Chapter 2. Despite intense scrutiny, Laura could find no fault in the full-length reflection in the mirror on the back of her hotel room door. She had bought a new dress for this occasion. The plunging sweetheart neckline was framed by two wide straps that almost formed sleeves because they somehow managed to hang at the very edge of her shoulders. The rest of her dress clung to her figure and finished just above the knee. It was black. It was, ironically, a French dress she'd found in a Glaswegian boutique. A necklace would have detracted from the way the design put the focus on her shoulders and collarbones, so Laura simply put her hair up into a neat chignon and wore long silver drop earrings that had crystals sparkling like tiny leaves on a vine. Even her makeup was flawless tonight. Had she, in fact, found the holy grail of freckle disguise in her new high-end mineral foundation? The black stiletto shoes were the perfect finishing touch. Laura was satisfied enough to take a photo of her reflection. If she ever found herself lacking in confidence ahead of, say, an important interview, she could take a peek at this image of a woman who looked like she had the whole world in her hands. A woman who was exactly who she wanted to be and where she wanted to be in life. But maybe the shoes weren't quite the perfect finishing touch after all. That would be when she was holding the premier award for sales as the regional winner. Could she dare dream of such a coveted achievement this year? If that happened, she certainly wouldn't need to be taking selfies. The Georgian architecture of this restored 19th century building, with huge Romanesque pillars and elaborately decorated ceilings, was a sharp contrast to the tumbled edges of stone and the almost organic jumble of ancient buildings in the south of France. Far more Laura's style, however, corporate and glittery, the kind of background that was perfect for the professional games of doing business and a world away from the kind of softness that whispered of romance and seduction. She approved of the military precision of the rows of wine glasses hanging by their stems above the bar, which were catching glints of light from enormous chandeliers, and the silver trays on the marble top of the bar with their sparkling crystal flutes of champagne already poured. Let the games begin. About to take a sip of her champagne, she put her glass down on the bar as she felt her phone vibrate silently in the small clutch bag she was carrying. Was it Ellie? Had she left her sister alone in a bat-infested house that she was too scared to sleep in? There were two messages on her phone. The first was from her mother wishing her luck for the awards ceremony tonight. The second was from a French number. No. Surely she hadn't somehow summoned the presence of Noah Dufour in a more concrete form than the random thought she was having trouble controlling. Perhaps Ellie had needed to get a new phone? But the message wasn't from her sister. It was a photo of what looked like a typical old French street, very like the ones Laura had been walking on only that morning. But she had no idea why it had been sent to her, or who had sent it. There was a door, an unusual archway-shaped depression in a wall with strange decorations, and a sign that read, La Farigoule. Text came next. Bonsoir, Laura. This is where I would have taken you to dinner if you were still here as part of our marketing research. My favourite resto in Vence. Laura blinked. Yes, on second glance she could see a wooden box on the wall which would have been a menu behind a glass door, and the odd-looking decorations in the archway made sense now. There was a bunch of grapes and a mortar and pestle. Even an octopus? She pushed the phone back into her tiny bag. Why would Noah think that she would have gone out to dinner with him anyway? His confidence was more like arrogance, and it wasn't attractive. It really wasn't. She picked up her glass of champagne and took a sip. Maybe it would wash away the odd tickle deep in her belly that almost felt like the butterflies of being nervous. Which she was, of course. She desperately wanted to win an award tonight, and not just in the categories of outstanding property presentation or client satisfaction like she had last year. No, she wanted the big one this time. Regional Estate Agent of the Year. In the meantime, there were people that Laura really should be networking with, including the CEO, Colin Armstrong. It wasn't often an opportunity like this presented itself, and was it her imagination? Or was there more than polite interest in his gaze as he nodded in her direction? Hadn't she heard recently that his wife had left him? Nobody had been particularly surprised. Colin was middle-aged, very successful, and it had to be said, more than a little boring. But boring men were safe, weren't they? Did it really matter if they were predictable and boring in bed as well? Good Lord, where had that thought come from? The same place, perhaps, that images of shaggy dark hair, designer stubble, and sinfully appreciative glances had been tucked away. The images of a man who was reckless enough to ride a motorbike. Did he carry pillion passengers on the back of that overpowered machine? Women who would have to be pressed against his body and cling on with their arms around him. Oh my! Laura took a much larger sip of her champagne, but put her glass down as her phone buzzed again. What if it was Ellie this time? It didn't really surprise her that it was another photo, but the actual image made her catch her breath. A garden courtyard with terracotta paving and a rough-hewn stone wall. Beams that were a playground for lush greenery overhead. The tables had white linen cloths and shining silver and glassware like the ones in the room Laura was about to go into. But this dining area had an understated elegance that was totally missing in the glitz and glamour of the event she was attending. The restaurant in Vence offered pure romance, especially when the central feature of this photograph was a table for two. Tucked away in a corner, with shadows from candlelight on the stonework and leaves, and the shelter of a nearby pillar with a flowering plant spilling from a hanging basket. It made a private oasis for lovers. It was an invitation that could make any woman breathe out a soft sigh of longing, the way Laura just had. Notre table, Laura. Un coupe de champagne pour toi, peut-être? Clearly, it had been unwise to give Noah Dufour a business card that also had her personal cell phone number, but the idea that an inexplicably attractive man in France was thinking about her right now was flattering, that's what it was. It gave her a sensation deep in her stomach that felt like the curl of an appreciative smile. That he was dangling the seduction of pure romance in front of her was... Oh, dear Lord, It was tempting, that's what it was. That feeling wasn't reminiscent of a smile any longer. It was more like a licking of lips. Romance on this level was something that Laura had never experienced and wouldn't trust anyway. But she had to admit that this photograph was exerting an oddly powerful pull. Laura did her best to dismiss the unsettling desire to be on the other side of the English Channel as the evening progressed. She really didn't want to be anywhere else, especially when it came to the highlight of the event. Colin was smiling broadly. And the award for the Property Centre's Regional Estate Agent of the Year in Oban, Argyll and the Isles goes to Laura Gilchrist. The applause was thunderous. Laura had to pose holding her trophy, and she had friends as well as the official photographer taking pictures. People forwarded copies to her as she accepted congratulations and celebrated with more champagne, because she wasn't driving home, was she? One photo stood out because the angle made her dress look as stunning as it had on the exclusive boutique's mannequin, and her smile made her look as if she was well aware of the significance of the award in her hands, but wasn't as excited as a small child on Christmas morning. Laura thought she might have a copy printed to go in a discreet frame in her office, but for now, she was just going to forward the image to her mother. It was time to do some celebrating, and she could see Colin walking towards her, holding a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. Hurriedly, Laura opened the recent message from her mother to forward the photograph. The ping of an almost instant response made her glance at the screen as she slipped the phone back into her bag. It also made her frown. Her mother never used emojis as a response to a text message. She was old school and preferred to use words. She would definitely not be sending a shower of hearts. Oh no. No, no, no. Colin was right beside her now. Congratulations, Laura. Tonight's award must be the icing on the cake for you right now. Someone's just told me that you've inherited a house in the south of France. I want to hear all about it. I'm thinking of getting into a bit of international real estate myself. And your award tonight. So well deserved. You must be very happy. Laura managed to dredge up a bright smile, but Colin's words were little more than a background buzz. She wasn't happy. She wasn't happy at all. Had she accidentally just sent that photo of herself to Noah Dufour? Chapter 3. One of life's great pleasures for Noah Dufour were the combined aromas of strong coffee and tobacco smoke, preferably enjoyed alone in a place that allowed him to watch the world waking up around him. This morning, however, he wasn't observing the activity in the square overlooked by the outside area of the café just outside the fortress walls of Saint-Paul-de-Vence. He was scrolling through messages on his phone. More specifically, the messages that had been received and sent by Mademoiselle Laura Gilchrist. Not that she'd responded to his initial contact with the restaurant photos, like the delightful food, so beautifully presented with its decorations of microgreens and tiny edible flowers. Even the picture of a single dessert with 2 silver spoons hadn't provoked her enough to comment. And Noah had almost given up trying to get through the barriers around the most stunning woman he'd ever seen. But then she'd sent him that photo. It was clearly intended to remind him that their relationship was strictly professional. He'd zoomed in on the plaque she was holding that proclaimed her the winner of what had to be a prestigious award in the Scottish real estate industry. Mais oh la la la. He'd looked at this image 1,000 times since, and if the intention was to create another barrier between them, it hadn't dimmed his longing one little bit. If anything, it had increased the impression that Laura Gilchrist was, quite simply, a goddess. A woman who deserved to be worshipped. It had been a mistake to send her the explosion of love hearts, of course, trop professionnel. But Noah had been far more circumspect since then. He'd resisted contacting her, waiting until he'd had an excuse. And that had been to let her know that the plumber he'd organised to attend to the hot water problem at La Maisonnette had been successful. Mike was going to line up the other tradesmen that might be needed as well. like a glazier and a builder. Her response had been brief. Merci beaucoup. And then there'd been a tiny chink of light through that professional barrier. How is Ellie coping, do you know? Is there anything that she needs? I'll call in on it today and find out. I'm going that way. I want to send you a photo of La Chapelle du Rosé in Vence. Henri Matisse considered the design and decoration of it to be his life's masterpiece. The house he lived in is nearby too, La Villa Le Rêve. Please do, famous artists are of interest to many people. Like restaurants? Noah couldn't resist nudging that professional barrier again. Were you tempted by La Faragule? The lack of response had been long enough for Noah to decide he'd pushed it too far. Then his phone signalled an incoming message. When he'd become engrossed in something else, the sound had made his heart skip a beat. You captured the romance of France very well. I'm sure one of those photos will end up in our brochure. The smiley face at the end of the text had been a surprise. Felt like Laura was taking a step outside the realms of her professional relationship too. A small step, perhaps, but it felt significant. The frequency of messages had gradually increased. As July arrived and summer settled in, Noah had been able to reassure Laura that her sister was coping very well with her new life in France. He'd added just a single heart that time. He'd sent the photographs he'd taken of the chapel in Vence with the stained glass windows and images painted on ceramic tiles, the pretty 2-storied house that Matisse had lived in, and some links to more information. He'd waited for Laura to respond to that, and he wasn't disappointed. She hadn't made him wait that time, despite the heart emoji he hadn't been able to resist adding again. Fascinating. I read that Picasso visited him there, and that Marc Chagall lived in Vence even longer than Matisse. Oui, there is a Chagall mosaic artwork in the Vence Cathedral, and his grave is in St. Paul de Vence. I wish I'd known. I'd like to have seen that. It's not too late, ma chérie. Come back and I will show you everything. Did you know that Vence is famous for having the smallest cathedral in France? There was no response to that, but Noah wasn't bothered. It had been their longest text conversation so far, and he had umpteen other local features of interest that were the perfect excuse to initiate further contact. Besides, he felt like he was getting to know this mysterious woman a little better now. She needed time to feel safe, and he had all the time in the world. He signalled the waiter. Addition, s'il vous plaît. He had work to do. But maybe he'd swing past La Cathédrale Notre-Dame de la Nativité in Vence to snap a photo of that mosaic on his way to view a potential listing in Grasse. If nothing else, when he checked the image, it would give him an excuse to look at that photo of Laura that had been automatically added to his camera roll. The one where her smile was reminiscent of all the seductive mystery of La Joconde, where she was wearing the gorgeous black dress that left her shoulders bare enough to invite a kiss and showed off collarbones his fingers simply itched to trace. It was past 5 o'clock in the morning and should have been daylight, but the dense cloud cover and pouring rain on the west coast of Scotland made it feel more like the middle of the night as Laura ran into the brightly lit gymnasium. It had, in fact, felt like summer had started fading weeks ago, almost as soon as she'd returned from that visit to France. She was shivering in her designer lycra leggings and matching crop top, but the first 10 minutes on the treadmill were enough for her to ditch the sweatshirt she kept on and hit the next level for speed and incline. Another 10 minutes and she would be warmed up enough to get stuck into her circuit routine. Maybe she'd feel a little more enthusiastic about it by then, although it didn't matter if she didn't. This was her routine, and it was paramount to stick to it. Routines, like boring men, were the threads that made up the safety net of her life, and she wasn't about to take the risk of letting them unravel. Besides, doing things that were good for you felt like you were building a credit that could be spent on something more enjoyable, eventually, even if it wasn't so good for you. Maybe especially if it wasn't good for you. She had her phone strapped to her arm to give her some music to accompany her workout, so the sound of a text message arrived via her Bluetooth earbuds, and while it was still earlier than 7 a.m. in France, she just knew that it had come from Noah. Or was she hoping it had? Bonjour, Laura. I hope you will have a good day. Laura used the rest of the 30 seconds of catching her breath to send back a 2-word response. You too. She wasn't smiling outwardly as she went to the first station of her circuit routine and picked up a pair of 5-kilogram dumbbells to do some single arm curls. But she couldn't deny it felt like she was smiling inside. Okay, the guy was arrogant and overconfident and maddeningly persistent, but she was getting so used to the contact that she'd stopped rolling her eyes and making him wait for any kind of response. They were working together after all, and ideas for the brochure to help sell La Maisonnette were coming together nicely. A lot of that professional contact was being exchanged via email rather than text messages now, with larger files full of photographs and property details being sent back and forth, but somehow the habit of texting had become just that, a habit. Only now it was more personal.